Welcome back. Our next contributor, the last one for the afternoon, is Professor Michael Udo Ekpo. I invite him to come forward. The title of his paper is Reading in African Creation Theology and Christian Anthropocentrism in Genesis 1:26-28. So we are really digging into these verses, so we hope to get more light and sparks coming from it in the discussions. So thank you very much, Professor Mike.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, the moderator, Paul, distinguished colleagues, my contribution this evening, as rightly mentioned earlier, is reading in and from Africa, creation theology and Christian anthropocentrism in the book of Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. This text and study humbly addresses Genesis text mentioned already and related text that contains themes of God's gifts of creation and humans, particularly Africans' invitation to care for the planet. This paper also acknowledges some ecological challenges facing Africa, some of which have already been mentioned by my distinguished colleagues and earlier presenter. It goes further to acknowledge efforts some individual religious groups and communities have made in Africa on the subject of ecology. It also challenges excessive Christian or religious anthropocentrism. I borrow that word from Pope Francis's Laudato Si, and of course broadly engages in a contextual and critical theological re-evaluation of Genesis creation theology in order to inspire rethinking in African religious communities as to their response to care for divine creation. I have already reposted the text, the material text on our platform, and which you can easily accompany me on this humble attempt to present this topic. First of all, I indicated what I call the ecological challenges facing Africa. I noted an article. In his article, Doing Ecology with African Creation Wisdom, our own brother, an African brother and a friend, Joseph Kizoy Masika, mentions, among other things, the challenge of lack of proper, distinctive ecological hermeneutics terminology among African scholars to address the issues of the Bible, creation, and ecology. Masika, citing Auntie Teresa Okure, notes that as a matter of cultural rule in doing theology, Africans do not start with issues of methodology necessarily. Rather, their primary consciousness is not method, but life and life concerns, their own and those of their own neighbors. It is more about an African's understanding of the human person and humanity's dependence on God and other aspects of the divine creation. In studies like this, questions regarding risking overgeneralization or homogenization of Africa and her context and values are often legitimately raised. When that is the case, there could be no better response than that of Pade Musana, another African scholar, that actually supports Okure's thesis that is always, for Africa, we always begin with asking who we are and who is an African person. Musani states that the concept of the human person in Africa is encapsulated in the thoughts and actions of African peoples, thereby giving credence to human relationship, shaping and determining the relationship in ways that cherish and value life-supporting and positive transformative effort in building human societies, irrespective of genders, race, and religion. Our own friend, known to all of us, Mbiti, John S. Mbiti, that passed away, I think, a few years ago, also addresses this concept of the human person in Africa, that only in terms of the other people does individual become conscious of his own being and his own environment, creatures. Echoes of Mbiti's understanding of the human person have also been heard from Kevin Van Hooser, who said in 1997 that the human creature is neither an autonomous individual nor an anonymous unit that has been assimilated into some collectivity, but rather a particular person who achieves a concrete identity in relation to others. David Kushi also states that all human beings, including Africans, are dependent not only on their fellow human beings, but also on a healthy environment. We need air, sea, fish, flowers, and other lower creatures to survive. In other words, every human being, Adam, needs clean air to breathe, sufficient water to drink, and of course, clean one for that matter, fertile and healthy soil, land to till, healthy neighbor creatures for clothing, food, medicine, and name them. Christopher Ngolele, another African scholar, an African sociocultural anthropologist, also affirms that an African, traditionally speaking, qualifies for full human identity only insofar as he or she lives in a harmonious relationship with fellow human beings and other creatures. But unfortunately, this is not always the case. As mentioned earlier by my two predecessors presenters, cases of deforestation, persistent drought, pollution, global warming, diminishing water supplies, and declining productivity from agricultural pastoral lands, worsening food security, heightened levels, pollution of the environment like the Ogoni mentioned earlier, have become an order of the day in our African cultures and environment. And beside these ecological challenges, we have also what I call here anthropocentric challenges. And what I mean by this, borrowing from Pope Francis, is always what we had heard earlier, always human beings, always presuming that we are inordinately superior to other creatures. In fact, Pope Francis discussed such an abuse in his 2015 encyclical, Laudato Si, that has become a famous quote in this forum. Francis speaks in this document about the crisis and effects of modern anthropocentrism, wherein human beings everywhere place themselves as the center of the world and abusing its environment. These anthropocentric tendencies needs a revision, a contextual revision in light of the text, the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verses 26 through 28. Verse 26, Vayomel Elohim, Narase Adam Basel Meno, Kip Metune. Then God said, let us make human being in our own image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea. 27a, and God created mankind in his own image. 27b, Oto Zaka Unekeva Bara Otham, male and female, he created them. And verse 28c, Ubechol Chaya Horumeshed al Haaretz, and over everything that moves over the earth. Anthropologically, within the context of this text of Genesis, we find what I call the constitution, limitations, and potentials of human beings, Adam. We see this in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26a. Let us make man Adam in our own image. And when read in connection with Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we see what this topic is all about. Stressing the anthropological element of human beings, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7 says, Then the Lord God formed man, Adam, mankind, from the dust of the ground. And the question then becomes, as already attempted by my earlier colleagues, presenters, the dust. One of the several commentators on this text, Brian S. Rushner, believes that dust in Hebrew, afar, from which we are made, is a reminder of a connectivity, of a connection with other things, such as the trees. Afar reminds us that we are related to the trees, to the flowers, to the land, to the sea, to the waters and the earth. And of course, the soul, nephes, distinguishes us from other living creatures. The use of the word afar does, Rushna insists, emphasizes both our physical frailty and the fact that we come from the ground and we shall also return to the ground. Many scholars that we are familiar with, and you find it in the text, have gone into details playing with this text, the wordplay of Hebrew, and of course of Adam, human beings, and Adamah, the soul. Of course, this introduces the motifs of the characteristics of this tradition. You have the details of this exegesis in the text. A good colleague of ours also, Kenneth Matthew, speaks of the significance of humanity's being made from the dust. His word seems to cover other relevant biblical passages. He says, God is depicted as a potter who forms Israel. Dust, as constitutive of human existence, anticipate where the penalty for man's sin is in his return to dust. And the text continues in the original text you have there in your hand. Other than the wordplay on the words man, Adam, and ground, Adamah, and its associate implication that man is related to the ground, this text also brings up the matter of the living soul, nephes chaya. The Hebrew word nephes, or psyche in Septuagint, is defined in BDB as that which breath, the breathing substance, or being, the inner being of man, and is commonly translated by word soul, living being, life, self, or person. The biblical anthropological terms, we've just reviewed some of them. Distinguished colleagues shed lights on the essence, on the limitation, on the potential and the meaning of the human person. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, a good example, the word image, the mute or Salem. A good example in Genesis chapter 5, verse 3, where we read that Adam's son Seth is in his likeness, in his own image. Read in connection with Genesis 1:26, this text suggests that the divine likeness was continued in Adam's son Seth and was transmitted to the succeeding generation. Various interpretation hermeneutics have been given to this word image, even in the tradition of the fathers, imago Dei, Salem Demut. Many have observed that the term image, or the terms image, talem, and likeness or demut of God are used interchangeably or synonymously in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. It is argued that these may point to a bifold nature of human relationship. As the likeness of God, humans stand before him, dependent and petitionary, while before the world, they function as theophanies, imitating God in perpetuity and registering his everlasting presence in the world. As the Salem of God, human beings, male and female, black and white, Africans and non-Africans, young and old, stand before God as his vice regent, through whom he administers divine lordship and justice to the world. In other words, since he made human beings in his own image, God authorizes human beings to serve as his deputies, as his co-creators, as his representative, commissioning them to care for the world. Strikingly, too, mentioned earlier, in Genesis 1 verse 27, bara is what we are all familiar with and specially used and with reverence to God. There is another Hebrew word I've not mentioned here that we are familiar with, asar. Man can asar the table, the glass, but man cannot bara the glass. It's only God that can bara. And it's a very unique word in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it is only God who can bara. Only God can create. Human being can asar, but human cannot bara. Uniquely, male and female, he created them. Zaka unekeva bara othum. Noticeable and significant is the plural pronoun othum, autos in Greek, used at the end of Genesis 1 verse 27. Various interpretation hermeneutics have also been brought to bear on the use of this plural othum and autos, male and female. One of them is that in this plural pronoun, othum or autos, is found a profound sense of African communal theology of living and personhood. Nelson Mandela and Bishop, who is that African? Desmond Tutu, and sometimes they will come up with this Ubuntu. But I consciously avoided that here because I've talked about that in my other presentation. There is no better way to sum up the analysis of Genesis 1, verses 26 to 27 than with these words from a friend of mine, Douglas. He says, "We bear God's image not by virtue of our wisdom, our reason, our stature, or strength, or even our capacity for moral judgment. A baby bears God's image just as you or I do, and as do the physically and mentally infirm. The stress in Scripture on the universality of the image of God demands that we recognize the image of God in all human beings and in all creatures." Verse 26, verse 27, that has already become so popular in this forum. Genesis 1:20, 28. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue the earth. God's purpose in creating human beings, Adam, in his own image, is not only that they may rule over other creatures, but also that they would be fruitful and multiply, peru urevu, fill the earth, umilu al-ha'ares, and subdue, vagit subha, in Genesis 1:27. This is not to say that God did not give other creatures their own space, but the significant, common, unavoidable question in verse 28 is what does subdue and rule the earth means? My earlier colleagues attempted vigorously to give an explanation and exegesis to this, but from my own perspective, in God's view, the words to subdue, kabash, or to rule, or to exercise dominion, radar, are very strong words that may connote some type of aggressive style of royal leadership. In the Septuagint translation, to rule or to have dominion over and lorded over is katakuriel. This verb is used in the Gospels and in other New Testament texts to refer to how followers of Jesus Christ are not meant to exercise exploitative leadership and dominion over one another. Matthew 20, 25 through 28, Mark 10, 42 to 51. The texts are there in the material print you have in your hand. Most stresses that Adamic vocation, the vocation of all human beings, whether male or female, young or old, black or brown or white, is to work and take care of the place where God has planted us, to serve Him in our rule of creation as priests in the temple. Taking care of the earth and one another is central to human beings' identity as God's image. Importantly, the ruling and subduing called for in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, must be done with reference to Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. That text, Genesis 1, chapter 28, should be read not out of context, but look at also Genesis chapter 2 and verse 15. In fact, Pope Francis in Laudato Si drew our attention to these two texts. To subdue and rule the land and the earth as images of God means that human beings are them all over the world, people of every status, kings and non-kings, including those in African countries, are to pattern their style of governing the world according to the model of the divine shepherd. We find this in Psalm 23, Jeremiah 23, and Ezekiel 23, and even look at John 10:10, that image of a good shepherd, what is expected of a good shepherd. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, that Genesis 1 and verse 28 must be read side by side with, in the broader context of this, Genesis 1:28, or God's purpose of creating humankind. Genesis 2:15 reads, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." Many have observed that the verbs "affat," to serve, could be given various interpretations, and as well as the verb "shama." For example, the verb "affat" can be used to describe different services Levites render in the tabernacle, in the temple. Numbers chapter 3, verse 7. Bloch, another scholar, footnoted there, sees the priest and the Levite service in the tabernacle or in the temple, through which they maintain the covenant relationship between Israel and God, as a microcosm of the world, so that the man was charged to serve and guard the garden, thereby ensuring the operation of Adonai's covenant with the world in general and living things and in the garden. That the service of the Levites and the priests could be microcosmically, if there is an expression like that, seen as a larger responsibility that humanity have been called to care and to cater for creatures. Shama is also a significant verb in this text. Shama shed light on the meaning of Genesis 1:28 as well. Although it is usually used to refer to keeping God's commandment, according to Mo, in the Genesis account, Shama equally refers to keeping watch over, guarding, preserving, and protecting peoples of all races, animals, trees of all kinds, all places, flowers, and our lower creatures. Finally, something that is uniquely I brought into this presentation is that let us not throw away the bad water. We know we have problems, challenges, ecological, anthropocentric problems in Africa, but some of us are making effort. Africans' positive responses to Genesis creation theology. There are many African religious communities, churches, individuals, publications, and organizations such as the Catholic Biblical Association of Nigeria, CABAN, ASE, the Baptist Church, Bracken's Horse Environmental Program, BEP, and the Symposium of Episcopal Conference of Africa and Madagascar, SECAM, I have deposited most of these their publications and writings. And for the past few years, in fact, some bishops here will agree, there have never been a session of the Caban meeting, even the last one, was dedicated to ecology, indirectly caring for the planet. Second, the past so many churches have actually and individuals contributed and emphasized the importance to care for the planet. And instructively, for all of us, I have left a detailed research on this, where so many of us Africans have actually contributed, made frank effort in caring for the environment. Let me just mention this in the last paragraph. Among many other churches, Catholic and Protestant, additionally, in their 2019 pastoral exhortation of the Symposium of Episcopal Conference of Africa and Madagascar, SECAM, the bishops took to heart the current ecological challenges from Africa. They observed that the ecological crisis is all about the relationship between humans and their natural environments. Africans have resorted to exploiting nature for economic and selfish ends, forgetting that nature, like human, is a gift from God, the creator and the sovereign of all creation. Of course, African culture of communal living is consistent with our invitation to rethink the need to harmoniously coexist with God's creature. Finally, what I have attempted here within the time allotted to me reminds us that the earth is part of our being that we carry within each and every one of us, which sustains us in daily life and in communion with God and all creatures. Above all, by caring for God's creation, we bring Him glory, who in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 28, created us in His own image and likeness. Basalmo Basalem Elohim Bara. He commissioned and missioned us alongside other biodiverse creatures to love, to care responsibly for one another, especially for the poor, for the planet, our common home. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. You did very, very well. It's an art to be able to squeeze it within the 30 minutes. So we have 15 minutes for question. Is there a preparation, a response to it? Yeah. Will you go move to the side here? Yeah, you can hear.
I didn't know it was Okay, there you go.
So, on behalf of the Assembly, I want to thank Father Professor Mike Udekbo for a well-delivered paper, which we all listened to, trying to read Genesis 1:26 to 28 in the African context. The paper is well written, and the exegesis of the texts of Genesis 1:26 to 28 is applied to the ecological crisis ravaging the world and Africa. The paper is designed as a contextual reading of these Genesis texts with within the African continent as a point, African continent as a point of reference. This is elaborately done through dialogue with various authors, as he mentioned. The conclusion is also adhered to the general design of the paper. Now, some critical issues. The footnote referencing format needs to follow the PACE approved format. You can mention it in the text there. Now, also notes should be taken of some typological errors, which I pointed out. Now, from the explanations, further explanations are needed on some of the issues. I mentioned some of the pages. Like when you talk of humans missioned alongside other creatures, commissioned and missioned, I think those terminologies need to be properly fine-tuned and explained, whether other creatures are commissioned and in what way. I wonder whether you adopt that idea that Africans do not start with issues of methodology in doing theology. You are quoting Masika, who was citing Okure. I would think that is a minority view, instead of generalizing it. And probably that made it possible for you not to adopt a methodology in the approach. And I think when you are doing such a contextual study, you can't but adopt a methodology. And the problem is that there is, I notice it in the text, there is need for a profile of this text. So you can give us what type of text is it? You are writing on Genesis 1, 26 to 28. But most of the time, you are using the second account of creation to back up your argument, without telling us the type of relationship or literary relationship between the first account and the second account. I know others have mentioned it, but you need to elaborate and tell us why the second account, especially 2:7, 2:15, are relevant to your own text. Because somebody can also disagree that they are different traditions. Then the interpretation of the image and likeness, this Selem and Demut, I think it needs further clarification on pages 8 and 9. Would it not, I will say here, would it not be better to explain it within the context of Genesis, rather than giving it a Christological interpretation, as you seem to adopt? Most of the time, people begin from Greek philosophy, other contexts, dogmatic context. I begin to imagine, what was the writer of Genesis thinking of when he was talking of the Demut, or the Selem of God? Then, the plural first person used in Genesis 1, 2, 6, you also addressed that. You cited those who said, who give it a Trinitarian interpretation, that God was addressing the Trinity. I was happy you didn't adopt that view, but then you suggested a Christological interpretation. And again, it would have been good to interpret it within the context of that text. Was the writer of Genesis thinking of the Christ or the Trinity when he was talking of let us make man in our own image? I think especially on the purely exegetical level, and that's one important issue. Then on page 10, on the question of male and female, he created them. You try to use it to talk about racism, what you call tribalism and ethnicism. Do you see how they related to that? Male and female, he created them. How do you bring it to as a preaching against racism and tribalism, ethnicism? But it's good to elaborate so that your reader will be properly informed. Just as Edmond for you, since you are going to this issue, you mentioned some of the sources, but I think you omitted the most important source in Nigeria. In 2017, the Catholic Theological Association of Nigeria, CATAN, organized a conference on ecology, theology and ecology, which has a fat book. So
Edited by you.
So you can't but consult it because this your text it was addressed almost by 3 people there. So, but having said all this, I think the paper was very rich, and I have to congratulate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have still a few minutes for some questions from the floor. Anyone wants to add wisdom or shine his
Flashlight.
thoughts on some wonderful statements in the text, or raise questions?
Luc a déjà relevé la question. Vous utilisez mâle et femelle pour régler des questions de racisme et de tribalisme. Ma question est la suivante. Est-ce que vous croyez que ces récits fondent l'unigénisme, c'est-à-dire que tous les humains descendent des mêmes parents? Est-ce que, exégétiquement, Israël est en train de faire son histoire ou l'histoire de l'humanité? Est-ce que Israël est en train de raconter sa propre origine ou l'origine de toute l'humanité? Merci.
Whether the question is whether the text is confronting the origin of Israel or the origin of the human race.
Interesting question. There are other exegetes here. They may look at it from different perspective. I took it from the perspective that the text is addressing Adam, the humankind, the text, the origin of the human person, and of course in an inclusive way, male and female. But historically, Israel will later become part of this human race, just as the Mauritians, Nigerians, and people of all walks of life. Thank you. It's interesting.
Thank you very much, Father Ufak, I prefer to call you. I find your paper really complimentary to mine. And in that regard, I congratulate you when we didn't sit together to do the research.
Thank you, Prof.
Then, but I want you to examine a little more the notion of image and likeness. And preferably, I refer you to Dictionary of Hebrew words.
Okay.
Yes.
I will.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much. Thank you. No. There is Patrick. Is it Patrick? Andrea.
My question in French. Can I put the question in French?
Of
Bon.
course.
Michael,
Yes.
merci pour ton paper.
Thank you.
Mais voici ma question. Comment entends-tu l'expression créer à notre image, à notre ressemblance? Quelle est cette image? Quelle est cette ressemblance? What does it mean? in our own image, according to our likeness.
Yes.
Qu'est-ce que ça signifie dans le récit pour vous? Donc, que devient l'homme ou que doit faire l'homme pour montrer qu'il est l'image et la ressemblance de Dieu? Okay.
What does it imply? What does man have to do to be that image, or how does he have to act if that is?
Image of God. Thank you very much. The text, the detailed text, as Luke also alluded to, there are different dimensions, different ways of interpreting the image, spiritually, morally, some which I have mentioned here. So many ways that we can turn out, even follow the footsteps, the preaching of the church fathers, to be imago Dei, to imitate Christ or the Lord or God, morally, ethically, and otherwise. So many ways that we can imitate Christ. The pluralism of interpretation of this have been found here and there, but I think, to the best of my ability, deposited reasonable, sufficient interpretation of this. It can be seen morally, being imitators of God, values of Christ, in charity, respecting one another, and being kind, being honest. These are different ways that this image could be given an interpretation. Yes. Are you happy? Or okay.
Bon. Donc, pour être à l'aise, je parle en français. Pour être à l'aise. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous avez lu certaines études narratives de ces dernières années qui montrent que les récits de la Genèse, donc ces récits que nous sommes en train d'analyser, présentent en fait une anthropologie narrative, c'est-à-dire une manière de montrer comment l'homme doit être. Qu'est-ce que l'homme et comment il doit être? Et alors, si l'homme est créé à l'image, à la ressemblance de Dieu, il doit agir comme Dieu. Et comment Dieu agit dans ce premier récit? Dieu crée par la parole et non pas par la violence. Comme je pense que c'est Chris qui a fait allusion au mythe avec Marduk. Il y a quelqu'un qui a fait allusion à ça. Marduk et Tiamat, où le dieu Marduk crée par la violence. Tandis qu'ici, Dieu crée par la parole. Donc, c'est-à-dire par la non-violence. Alors, l'homme est à l'image de Dieu tant qu'il agit aussi comme Dieu, c'est-à-dire par la parole. C'est pourquoi, en Genèse 2, l'homme exerce cette fonction de dominer par la parole en nommant les êtres. Donc, on montre qu'il y a si vous voulez, une cohérence narrative dans ces récits qu'il faut comprendre. Je ne sais pas si vous êtes au courant de ces études-là narratives.
A long history, but yet the question is whether you are aware of narrative readings which look at these texts in terms of in terms of an anthropology. What does it mean to be a human person, and what does it involve? Whether you follow the image, for instance, of Marduk, who creates by means of violence, or whether you create by means of the word.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Father. Honestly, I have dedicated mileages of 3-4 pages, actually giving the anthropological analysis of the image. If you look at the text in English, the Chaldea, the Nephus, and what it takes to be human anthropologically. Of course, and I'm a narrative reader. This narrative can go back as far as thousands of years of history, different interpretation that have been given to these texts in the Babylonians Assembly of Gods, the Demiurge, the Ashar, the Ashate, and all that. I didn't want to get into that, but I've left some of those historical antecedents on the footnotes that we can always consult just to save time. Thank you very much.
We have come to the end of this session, but according to the program, we have still time for discussions. So shall we? Sure. We begin by thanking Michael for your efforts and for such a big paper and for your replies.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and all the best.
Thank you very much.
Une autre question, mais je voudrais préciser que les discussions de 17h45 pour toute la conférence de la journée, au cas où vous auriez une question que vous n'avez pas pu poser. What I mean is that the discussions of this slot is just for all the discussions of the day, in case all the presentation of the day, in case there is let us say a question or a contribution you have to make and you didn't have enough presentation. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you. I want to continue, I think along the same lines as Kabasele. Michael, thank you for your paper. In the ancient Near East, if you would go into a temple, you would find an image of the deity. But if you went into the tabernacle or the temple in Jerusalem, you would find an empty space. I wonder if you would be open to the idea that the space is empty because God created an image of himself, not as a graven image, but by creating human beings. So the image of God is less a substance or a characteristic of human beings, but a vocation of human beings. We are called to represent God in the world. Is that something that resonates with your presentation?
In the text, I left about 3-4 paragraphs there, making reference to the understanding of the image of God in the ancient Near Eastern text and culture. And of course, what the bishop, our friend rightly said, is true. A space could also be left by different cultures in tradition to allow God to occupy the space of creation. And also ourselves are invited to be co-regents and to be imitators of God. I mean, there is no end to this Genesis interpretation of Genesis 1:26. Thousands of years ago, ancient Near East, people have been wrestling with this, even down to the Ignatius, the church fathers, the Trinitarian, even the pluralism, let us, and who are the us? This is another issue. So we are open to this, but as much as we can, within our own context of Christianity, we narrow and highlight the interpretation within the context of our faith. Thank you very much.
Well, it's to add a little more as we are coming nearer. The answer is that the Hebrew author was here cajoling so many images and figurines that were notable in the Babylonian traditions. Even today, when we look at the excavations from Syria, you will see that everywhere were different kinds of images. So their religion was based on image, observation, and worship. But the monotheism of the Hebrew author rejected flatly that image and likeness of different deities and presented a God who is in us and for us and makes humans be like him. image and likeness. It connotes a lot, but it is a parody on the pluralism of images in the Mesopotamian and Babylonian religious culture. Can that help us? Andre? All right.
I think that's very enlightening, what Professor Manu said. Because if you, but I'm looking at it from the other dimension. Like those, I agree with those who said this text was written within the context of the exilic and post-exilic period. And now, this text, if you read it together with the commandment that do not make any image of God, and here God is saying, let us create man in our own image. Now, there was one author who was saying that it was God who created the human being in his own image. So the human being has no right to make God in human being's image. So because God created man in his image. So man cannot make God in his image. So it was God's prerogative to make image of himself, not a human being. And so that even underscores that particular commandment, that no human being has a right to make image of God. Only God can make image of himself. Thank you.
Sister Gazella, say something on your Galatians and Genesis. She was one of the scholars I quoted.
Yeah, maybe we could also enrich, if we look at enrich the understanding of the image of God, because in the New Testament, then Paul will not consider the man as the image, the mankind as image. Christ, the Son of God, is the image of the Father. I don't know whether you looked at it or you deepened in your paper, Father. Yeah.
What Father is saying in the New Testament, of course, Adam, humankind, Adama, in Romans, and we've all read Paul. Christ is the new Adam, the Son of God, being enlarged in the New Testament, even in the Aramaic, that has also infiltrated the Pauline and the New Testament interpretation. So Christ is the new Adam. Through one man, one Adam, sin came into the world. Through one man, the new Adam, salvation and victory came into the world. Where are the female?
According to the program, we have until 18:30, and it's followed by free time. So, what does the secretary say? Right. Are there still any questions to discuss? We are. So the aim is to ask questions or continue the discussion with any of the speakers of this morning. So
Auntie, do you want to say something? I can put you on the floor. Sister Teresa Kure is online.
Sister Okure online. Oh.
Yes. Okay, Auntie the moderator, they can hear you.
Hello, Sister Teresa.
No, I have been sending, I sent a message that I think there are two things. I don't think it is right for us to limit our interpretation of this text or any biblical text to what Western scholars understood. That's point one. Then point two is that we're talking about John 1:18 that says nobody has ever seen God. So if that is the case, if we want to know what being in God's image and likeness is like, we have to look at the word that became flesh. In the totality of his relationship across the board, uniting in himself the male and female, reaching out to creation. So that, the Bible is one, it's from Genesis to Revelation. So I don't think we can just get stuck with Genesis and then not see the progressive revelation of God in the rest of the New Testament. And as for the email, the question about whether it is male first or female first, Genesis is very clear that the human being, Adam, is male and female. It is there in Genesis 1:26 to 27. It is repeated with emphasis in Genesis 5:1 to 2. God created them and named them Adam. So when we begin to, Genesis 2 is on a different agenda. And Genesis 2, as I see it, the text of Genesis 2 is verse 24. That they become one flesh, because they started by being one flesh at the beginning, and they ended up being one flesh. So that two different purposes. And then the history of Israel begins with Abraham.
Let us listen
Genesis
to what
1:11 is about.
Can you hear? Right, thank you. So this raises, well, a number of speakers have been trying to specify which particular context they were talking about. We don't speak about the meaning of the text in the absolute. The text is always has a meaning in a particular context, and there are many contexts, and the contexts continue. So a number of speakers have been specifying which context they were talking about, and but that's right. I think you can still put it in an African context, or you can try to find out what it meant in the context of the Babylonian exile. But these are all different contexts. So I think. Are there any comments on what Sister Okure said, or any? Yes, Luke. Yes. Oh.
She raises a very important issue on the image. Jesus has the icon of God. And I thought she would land on something, which she didn't land. When he said that Adam was male and female, then God has to be, you know, if it is in the image of God. So God is male and female. So, but she didn't land there. So, but I think that's the problem of using another context to interpret the Genesis text. I would have loved John to explain what he meant when he was talking of reading this text within the context of the post-exilic period, Israel period. Because when we read it in the historical context of Israel, the text becomes very meaningful. And before bringing it down to the African context, I think we have to understand first its original context. Without that, we'll be just doing eisegesis, whatever appeals to us. But we have to understand what it meant to the original author and the original context.
Right?
Original author and original context which we make of ourselves. How do we know the original At least that's the way I see it. So you make the best of, you know, the scripture is not an iconoclastic, put it in pieces. It is God's action from Genesis to Revelation, and the revelation is going on. So you have made a very important point. It's okay to get stuck and to struggle with that. But it is limiting the word, limiting the spirit, limiting God to get stuck in a context that we really don't know. The guesswork of scholars.
But Auntie, you are now talking like the Pentecostals. You know, we discuss.
That's your interpretation. It's not Pentecostal.
Because the word has a context.
The text, the biblical New Testament text, it leads us.
Yeah.
The New Testament text leads us. Read about it, John 1:9. Jesus says you search the scriptures. You hope to find meaning there. But I am the one, the full meaning of scripture. It's not me. And the church says that. You come from day to night, but they are all talking about me. So I give full meaning to scripture. That's why I brought that. And why are we struggling with this? Is it to know what they did then, or to know where we are supposed to be today? That's my question.
But because there is a human author.
Right. Right. I think we have understood what Sister Okure was saying, that as I said, the text only means something in a context. So you can only try to figure out what people meant in a particular context. And if we, you want to say something about narrative readings? Narrative readings seem to be creative, isn't it? They bring the text forward into our own context, or not, you know.
I was listening to Auntie and my distinguished colleague and Luke. Personally, there is nothing wrong. In fact, the Catholic Church, which we all know, where to begin exegesis is always to go back to the history. But it's always to balance that up. Both the diachronic and the synchronic must always be invited to the table of exegesis. I'm sure none of us here will disagree with that. So extremism or fundamentalism is not always there. Both diachronic and synchronic is where we always stand. And scripture is not a monophony. but a polyphony. We should listen to everyone and then make the best out of the text. Thank you very much.
Right. It
Jim-
seems
Jim.
the game is over. So
The idea.
the secretary has spoken. Right.
Je voudrais vraiment remercier notre cher Père Paul de Coq qui a accepté de nous. Merci. Qui a accepté d'être modérateur. Je n'avais trouvé personne encore et il a accepté de prendre toute la journée, malgré son âge. Merci beaucoup, vénérable Père. C'est bien. Alors maintenant, on a quelques minutes de détente avant les vêpres suivis du souper. D'accord, merci. Alors, bonne soirée et merci à vous tous et à vous toutes pour vos contributions, vos interventions. Merci.